In this lecture, we are going to look at high-risk systems. Remember that the vast majority of the obligations apply to high-risk systems, so this is important not only for the exam, but also for your professional journey. We will define what a high-risk system is, look at examples of high-risk systems. These are located in Annex III of the EU AI Act. As before, I've put together a mnemonic device to help you remember some of these examples, and we will conclude by looking at some exceptions. Again, the EU AI Act focuses mostly on high-risk systems. Classifications will depend on the specific use. Now, I don't think you're going to need to produce or remember a citation for the exam, but again, just in case you're interested in looking this up and reading through it on your own, the criteria is outlined in Article 6.1 and Annex III. In order to be a high-risk system, the system must meet both 6.1 criteria or be listed in Annex III. At a glance, a high-risk system will fall under one of two very broad categories. It will either be a product safety issue, or the system will pose a significant risk to health, safety, and fundamental rights. Under product safety, the AI will be a component of a product covered by EU legislation. This could include toys, machinery, medical devices, or transportation, just as a few examples. In Annex III of the EU AI Act, the following use cases are considered high risk: biometric identification and categorization of natural persons, critical infrastructure, migration, education, employment, essential private public services and benefits, administration of justice or the democratic process, and law enforcement. Now, you'll remember that biometric identification and categorization was also included as a prohibited or unacceptable risk system. And I'm going to provide some guidance on how to parse the two out at the end of the lecture. Before we look at the mnemonic device, I just want to unpack the meaning of private and public services and benefits here because that's a bit broad. So under the EU AI Act, when we're thinking about public and private services, this might help provide a little bit more clarity for you. If the system is used in determining eligibility or evaluation for public assistance, for example, for healthcare, then that would fall under the public-private services. Similarly, creditworthiness. An exception would be detecting financial fraud. Another example would be a pricing risk assessment for life and health insurance. And finally, a system that classified emergency calls, for example, calls that are being made to a police station, fire station, or someone in need of an ambulance. For the mnemonic device, I want you to think about eating an expired meal or a BC meal. So I want you to think back to maybe some of your younger days as an adolescent or a college or university student. I'm referencing my own experience here, but I didn't have a lot of money, and I would often keep leftover food in the refrigerator for way too long. And perhaps on a Saturday or Sunday morning, after a late night of partying, I would wake up, I would feel terrible. And of course, what I want is some greasy, really heavy food to help wash away the previous night's activities. I would go to the refrigerator, I would open it up, there would be a couple slices of pizza from a week or two ago. And before I would heat that pizza up, I would think to myself, is it safe to eat this? I could get food poisoning. It's looking a little funky. And so think of this as an expired meal. Expired, something that's very old, BC, before Common Era. That's actually BCE, but that's the BC that I'm thinking of. And so eating an old or expired meal, this is high risk. Sure, you can eat it. Maybe there'll be no problems. You may also eat it and get food poisoning. So there's a high risk here. I want to come back to this issue of emotion and biometric systems. These are included as unacceptable and prohibited, and also as high risk. And so under what situations are they unacceptable? Under what situations would they be just high risk? For emotion recognition systems, the prohibited applications are education and the workplace. For biometric categorization and identification, The unacceptable use cases are using certain sensitive characteristics, and for identification, that application being used in public apart from, so there's an exception here, authorized situations by law enforcement. So hopefully this can help you compartmentalize this in your brain as you prepare for the exam. Finally, a quick note on the criteria outlined in Article 6.1. When systems are intended to be used as a safety component of a product, or the system itself is a product covered by union harmonization legislation listed in Annex I, and the system is required to undergo a third-party conformity assessment with a view of putting the system on the market. So if the system meets both of these criteria, it would be high risk. Now, I don't think you're going to need to know the term union harmonization for the exam, but you'll remember earlier we looked at the term market surveillance authority. Market surveillance authority was tied to another piece of legislation. Well, that piece of legislation is considered union harmonization. This is a category of laws that are all weaving together different statutes. And so union harmonization legislation, this is existing EU laws that harmonize rules across member states for specific sectors or products. And there is a list of all of these in Annex I of the EU AI Act. Again, I don't think you need to know the union harmonization legislation, that term for the exam, but because it pops up a lot throughout the EU AI Act, it's important that you understand the concept. Now, for high-risk systems, there are 4 exceptions that you should remember. Exception A, B, C, and D. For each of these exceptions, I've highlighted the key word for you to remember. So I'm providing full context, but for the exam, I would just commit to memory the highlighted word in each of these cases. So exception A is for systems that fall in Annex III, but they perform a narrow procedural task. For example, an administrative support system. This system categorizes files without making decisions. For example, it sorts job applicants by qualification, but does not make a hiring decision. This would be an exception to a high-risk system. Exception B concerns quality control systems. Again, this is going to be a system that's in Annex III, but improves the result of a previously completed human activity. For example, reviewing completed medical diagnoses as a means of oversight. However, the final decision remains that of the doctors. Another example, a system that analyzes past legal documents to suggest relevant precedents. The system does not interpret the laws. So again, key takeaway here, quality control system. Exception C concerns monitoring systems. Again, this is a system that's in Annex III, but it detects decision-making patterns or deviations from prior decision-making. For example, analyzing historical sentencing data or identifying significant deviations from sentencing. An example would be identifying patterns in employee attendance, also reviewing HR manager reviews and decisions. Another example of monitoring systems would be detecting border control anomalies. And again, here, law enforcement is taking the action, not the system. The final exception concerns pre-screening tools. So again, this is a system that's in Annex III, but performs a preparatory task to an assessment relevant to use cases listed in Annex III. Examples include compiling preliminary information on job applicants without conducting ranking, and gathering data points for educational evaluation, but the evaluation is still done by the teacher. So very quickly, I'm going to go back to exception A and go A, B, C, D just very quickly. So again, exception A, remember administrative support system. Exception B, remember quality control system. Exception C, remember monitoring system. And exception D, remember pre-screening tools. In this lecture, we have defined what a high risk is under the EU AI Act. The 2 main categories are product safety and systems that pose a significant risk to health, safety, and fundamental human rights. I know it's laborious and burdensome, but you're going to need to remember the list of high-risk systems here. You should absolutely anticipate seeing something like this on the exam. The mnemonic device to hopefully aid your memorization is BC meal. Remember the risks involved with eating something that is possibly expired. And remember examples of the 4 exceptions. These are administrative support system, quality control system, monitoring systems, and pre-screening tools.